Welcome to BT Podcasts. In this episode, find out how in ESG investing, ethical considerations and financial performance are no longer mutually exclusive. This episode is brought to you by Income Insurance.
A recent report found Singapore investors have become less active in ESG investing or environmental, social, governance investing over the past year and have grown less hopeful about the ability of these funds to outperform. The decline followed an overall downtrend across Asia, where the proportion of investors holding ESG funds while keeping their allocation high has been shrinking. And yet, Income Insurance has decided to continue fighting the good fight, committing $1 billion, that's with a B, in climate transition financing. What's helping them keep the faith and moving forward? Welcome to Podcast by the Business Times. I'm Howie Lim, and we're speaking to the Chief Investment Officer of Income Insurance, David Chua, to get the thinking behind this swimming upstream behavior, so to speak. David, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Howie. Thanks for having us here.
1 billion. That's a lot. So Income Insurance is committing that 1 billion, right? And the bulk of your assets is already in Asia. So I'm thinking you're going to continue to focus on the Asia region?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Income Insurance has been around in Singapore for the last 54 years. And as an asset owner, we oversee approximately $43 billion of assets under management. So something like this, which is around the environmental, social and governance causes, is not something new to us. In fact, we had already committed $100 million towards social causes in Singapore. But increasingly, as we think about the rest of Asia, we feel as a steward of the capital, it's important that we also channel some of our financial capital in order to drive the evolution and the development in that space.
Yeah. What's though the impetus for continuing to head into Asia? Because it's quite a diverse region. It's difficult. Everyone's sort of economic journey is different at this point.
Well, it is. And in fact, if you do read about the challenges that climate financing is facing, the real battle, or where people think that the most challenges will come, is in Asia. And for the very reasons that you just mentioned, we do see that there are very diverse economic developments across the region. At the same time, the political climate, the differences, the jurisdictions differ. And quite frankly, I think even the market development and opportunities have a wide range.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I would say that's also exactly where we see our responsibility and our ability to then influence the change within that space. Just to give you an example, if you look across just Southeast Asia, the bulk of the energy, or what we call the renewable sources, are coming outside of Singapore. But if you think about the consumers, or where most of the energy demands are in fact coming up from cities such as Singapore and the capitals around Southeast Asia. But do we have the grit to channel all of these renewable energy sources back to where the users need them? It's going to be a long haul before we get there. And I think for Income Insurance, we feel that we have a need to contribute to that.
What are some of the other challenges you think Asia faces when it comes to participating in environmental, social governance, right? This whole ESG movement. Because, you know, if a person is worried about whether or not they'll have a meal tomorrow, you can't really worry about the world, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's always been one of the biggest criticism when you talk about climate transition, right? There's a difference between for those who already have and those who don't have. And I think in Asia in particular, that's a very real question that we need to address. How do we ensure a just and inclusive transition, right, across Asia? It's very easy to say, let's stop coal plants, and let's just retire them and go into renewable energy sources. But what does that mean for the workers who are working in these coal plants, right? And what does it mean by extension to their family and so on? So we believe when we talk about climate transition, right, it's not just about the financial cost, but just as importantly, we need to factor in the social cost.
Thanks for bringing that up because, some parts of Asia still rely on that traditional energy source like coal. How are you going to balance your ESG commitments then? Because you're working with some heavy or industries that are heavily reliant on coal. Feels a bit counterintuitive because if you work with them, then they feel that their existence is still justified and it's all counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And how if I can share an anecdote with you? I was, in fact, in one of the conferences talking about exactly this topic. And as we were talking about how we should all go green and renewables and so on. And it was interesting. One of the business owner actually stood up during the Q&A and said,
I don't care. No.
I'm in what you term to be the polluting, the dirty industry, but I want to go green, right? How are you as investors helping me to go green? And this is where I think the approach has changed, right? From excluding capital towards these industries, towards more engagement and more support in terms of how do we help them, right? And I think many of them have good intentions to transit from brown to green. And this is really where the direction is going to. And in our case, I think we see a good opportunity to engage with our partners, right, across fund managers, increasingly through them to our investee companies in order to help them to transit through this period of change.
And you feel this approach will help to, say, decarbonize the whole of the real economy, so to speak?
Well, it's going to be a huge effort and undertaking across everyone who's involved in this space, to be honest. There will be many stakeholders who needs to be playing a part in there.
Yeah.
Right. In our case, if you think about the gap that Asia is facing, is close to $1 trillion a year. Just in terms of financing gap.
How many zeros is that?
That is many zeros. And this is where I think for us, even with 43 billions of assets, it's really just a tiny part of the entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
And this is where I think our approach has been to think about how do we better influence the rest of the stakeholders? How do we engage and work with other asset owners, other insurance companies like ourselves, to jointly work with the governments, to jointly work with the companies, in order to make sure that we can then move together in tandem towards net zero.
We're speaking with David Chua, who's the Chief Investment Officer of Income Insurance. So we've covered the amount of money they're putting into the region. We've covered how they're going to do it. We're going to cover what else is in store. Stay with us here on BT Podcasts.
And now back to BT Podcasts, brought to you by Income Insurance.
David Chua is the Chief Investment Officer of Income Insurance. David, what about a report that showed that Singapore investors are becoming less active in this space? You know, they feel as though those funds aren't going to give me the return. Selfish, I know, but those are the realities of the world. People want their investments to make money. What do you make of this, and what do you think can be done to sort of reignite their interest?
I would say a lot of the hype over the last few years, and perhaps also one of the biggest criticism, has been around the marketing hype around ESG, how we're going to drive world changes without the real understanding of peeling back the onion and saying, okay, what do the strategies really in their execution deliver? What do they achieve? And how do they impact the real economy? I think this is where the consumer starts to get a lot more discerning in asking those questions. On top of that, the past few years' performance hasn't been great for some of these strategies because of how commodities and oil prices has continued to shoot up. And I think that's where the challenges of the outflows that you've just mentioned. But to be honest, sustainability is going to be a long drawn target that we need to hit towards. It's not about how it's going to perform in the next 2 months and 3 months. So in income, we do take a rather longer term perspective when we think about sustainability.
Long is how long?
Well, it depends. Some of our liabilities can go up to 20, 40 years. But for us as investors, we think about the next 10 to 15 years in terms of the horizon. But at the same time, we then think about what are the near-term risks that's arising from this climate transition. And whether you think of ESG investing from a return perspective or risk mitigation perspective, right? Those are the considerations that you need to have, because clearly you don't want to be holding on to stranded assets, stranded companies who have not caught up with the developments as regulatory environment changes, consumer demands changes, and just more awareness around the sustainability practices.
Speaking of stranded, I mean, no man is an island. So Income, you have these strategic partnerships that you've set up. How are they helping you advance your sustainability objectives?
Right. So back to the point that I mentioned around being able to collaborate across the ecosystem. That is, I think, one good example that we have had. We work in an outsourced asset owner framework. So we basically outsource we give the money to fund managers to invest. And this is where we feel that the biggest impact will be felt as we work together with these fund partners. We have come up with the engagement and stewardship statement, which essentially spells out what income insurance believes in terms of our role in this transition, and how we then expect our fund managers to think about and to work with the investee companies in that sense. So one of the more recent investments that we have made have been through the Fullerton Carbon Action Fund. Fullerton is one of our key strategic partners. We have committed $50 million of investments towards Asian investments. And these are basically money that's going to be channeled into climate enablers and also climate beneficiaries within this part of the world. So that's one part of it. And the other bit that we have been doing is also to increasingly expand our investment-linked funds to include sustainable fund solutions. An example would be the JP Morgan Global Income Sustainable Fund that we have launched just earlier this year. And I would say the third and perhaps one of the most important aspect is also around how we then engage on the slightly more technical parts of the climate transition in terms of the knowledge exchange, as well as training and equipping our staff to be able to appreciate and understand the climate changes that's happening to the portfolio and their investment positions.
And then what else is Income going to do to continue evolving your sustainability strategy? Because market trends change as well.
Well, this is where we see us taking more of a leading voice in terms of some of the partnerships that we have set up. Beyond the fund partnerships that I just mentioned, we are also involved in the Life Insurance Association and the General Insurance Association. These are industry associations in terms of debating what is the role of the industry to move towards that. And just earlier last year, we also joined the Asian Investor Group on Climate Change, as well as the Singapore Sustainable Finance Association. So these are the platform and the associations where we believe bring like-minded asset owners, financial participants is really going to drive the real change.
David, I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you for having me here, Howie.
David Chua is the Chief Investment Officer at Income Insurance. I'm Howie Lim. This has been BT Podcast from the Business Times.
This episode of BT Podcasts was brought to you by Income Insurance. Find more BT podcasts at businesstimes.com.sg/podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is meant to provide general information only. SPH Media accepts no liability for loss arising from any reliance on the podcast or use of third parties' products and services.